Hi everybody, my name is Courtney and I am fairly new to cookie decorating, so I figured I would start a YouTube channel so that not only I can get better, but hopefully you can learn from some of my mistakes as well. Today we are going to make a baby shower set and it is a strawberry theme. So I'm starting off with the strawberry. All of the cutters that I'm going to be using today are by Ann Clark. I'll link them in the description box below. I am starting out with my outline with a piping consistency and then going right in with my flood. I prefer not to let my outline dry just because I don't like seeing the outline. That is totally my preference, personal preference, whether or not you want to see that outline or not. So I typically, while it's still wet, I take my scribe and kind of spread that icing out even more just to kind of cover up a little bit of that outline. We're going to be doing a little bit of wet on wet here. So while this is still wet, I'm going in with a flood consistency white, and I'm going to be making just dots all over the place. And while that is still wet, I am going to take my scribe. I'm going to start right in the center of that dot and pull down. If you start too high up, you're going to create kind of like a heart. And if you start too far down, it's just going to kind of turn blobby. So once that is done, you have to kind of work a little quick. I'm going to set that aside to dry so that can crust over, and I'll have definition between the stem or the leaves and the strawberry itself. I usually wait about a half an hour or so. I don't use a dehydrator, so I just let everything air dry. I'm outlining that again with the green piping consistency and then going right in with that flood. Once again, taking my scribe to kind of spread that out. This is a smaller area. I probably should have done a little bit of those scribbles or poked some holes in it just to eliminate any craters, but luckily I didn't get any. So once that one's all set, we're going to move on to the next cookie, and this is going to be the little footprint. So I am just going to outline this entire thing with white, again going in with my piping consistency. My piping consistency isn't as thick as some prefer it to be. Mine is more of a toothpaste consistency. That way I can still work with it a little bit. I have a little bit of time to fix my mistakes before it crusts over too much. Once that is outlined, I'm going to go in with my white flood consistency. I prefer to outline the image and kind of go right along that outline and then fill it in going from the outside in, if that makes any sense. I know some people like to kind of just plop some icing in the center and use their scribe to spread it out. I've tried that. I just don't get a very even coverage, and that's probably just a me thing. But I am going to let this crust over for about a half an hour or so. You want a good crust on this before you move on to the next step. And this is going to be the footprint itself. And I'm using the pink for this. Again, I'm starting off with the piping consistency and just outlining the foot part. With the little toes, I'll do something a little bit different. But I'm going to go right in with my flood. Now this is not obviously, the white is not obviously dry. It's just crusted over. And this will hopefully eliminate any craters that I might get. But when you use your scribe, you want to be super careful because that white is not dry. It's only a little bit crusted on the top. So if you go a little bit too deep with that scribe, you may puncture the white and then you'll have white and pink mixed. So for the toes, this is actually my piping consistency. And I'm doing this because dots like this tend to crater, and for me anyway. And when I say crater, I end up with a big hole in them once it dries. So the thicker the icing, the less likely it is to get those craters. But it takes a little bit of work to kind of even that out. I'm using my piping bag to kind of spread that out as I pipe it out, but I'll also use my scribe to get rid of any peaks that might be left over. Next is this little bib. So I'm using the piping consistency of the green. I really wasn't sure how to decorate this one, but I figured I would just make a strawberry pattern. So I'm only doing 2 little sections at a time just because this is a thicker icing and it will crust over fairly quickly. So I'm just adding a little bit of that icing to each one of those little scalloped edges. And then I'm taking a paintbrush. This is a Wilton brush, but quite honestly, you could use any paintbrush you want. It doesn't have to be for cookie decorating. I used to have a crafting channel, and I know probably some of my viewers from that channel are probably watching this video, and they will know that I tend to be a little cheap and I like to cut corners where I can. So you can go to the dollar store and get a bunch of paintbrushes and use those for your cookie decorating, as long as you just stick to cookie decorating with the brushes. So once I make it all the way around, and I'm sorry about that angle, I'm still kind of getting used to this video thing, I let that crust over for only about 10 or 15 minutes because it is a thicker icing. It will go pretty quick. And then I am going to outline the bib, just making sure that those scalloped edges can still be seen, but I'm kind of covering up any mistakes that I may have made. Outlining that with my piping consistency and then going right in with the flood icing. And we're pretty much going to do the same thing. Well, we're not pretty much. We're doing exactly the same thing as we did for the strawberry. I am using the pink icing, using my scribe to kind of spread that out and even that out a little bit. And then I am going to make those dots again with the white icing while this pink icing is still wet. Now, whenever you do a wet on wet technique, you kind of have to move a little bit quicker. The thinner the icing is, the more time you have to work with it. I don't usually count when I'm mixing my icing. I know a lot of people say 20-second, 15-second flood icing. I would say mine is probably around a 20-second flood if I had to guess. It's definitely not too thin, but I've also made floods that are a lot thicker than this, so it's not too bad to work with. So now that that one is all set, we're going to move on to this little one piece. It's not really a onesie, I guess. I'm not sure really what you would call it, but this is going to be another wet on wet technique here. But this is a huge cookie. You can't tell on camera, but when you see the final set all together, you'll see how much bigger this cookie is than the rest of them. So this is a bigger area to work with, more icing to flood, and less time to really work with it. So I am outlining it again with that white icing, piping consistency icing, and then flooding that in. And you'll see that I am not going to totally fill it in like I did with the rest of the cookies. So I'm outlining it just like I normally do, but as I start to fill it in, you'll see that there's a lot of gaps. Not only am I trying to work pretty quick because I know that I'm doing a wet on wet technique that will take some time, but I don't want to over flood because I'm going to be adding so much icing to this for the background. Well, it's not the background, the pattern, I should say, that I don't want the icing to start dripping off the side of the cookie. So the icing is very light for the white. Next, I am going to put strawberries all over this thing. I'm pretty much just making a triangle with a rounded end to it. There's really no right or wrong way to do this, and I'm kind of just scattering them throughout the entire cookie. The only thing you want to make sure that you do is you actually want to fill in that entire little triangle or whatever you're making, because as it spreads and as it sits into the white icing, you'll see any gaps. So I want to make the little dots on the strawberry, or for what the seeds are. So I'm using, again, piping consistency because I want it to settle all in, but I'm not squeezing the bag, and I'm working very, very quickly. I'm just barely touching the bag to the cookie to leave little dots behind, but if you squeeze the bag too much, they will spread. So they might look small now, but in a minute or two, you'll see that they get quite a bit larger. Next, I'm going to add these little leaves or stems. So I'm just basically blobbing on some of that green icing. You'll see that this cookie is taking me about 5 or 6 minutes, and it's wet on wet, so you have to work quick. So I'm taking that scribe, and this is a very thin, sharp scribe, and I'm wiping it off each and every time, and this is where I stabbed myself. So I had to hurry up and get a paper towel, wrap that around my finger, and continue going before this crusted over too much. But I'm just basically pulling some of that green up so that it kind of sort of looks like leaves. Once that is dry, and I let this dry for probably about a half an hour once again, just to do this little outline. I'm taking some of the pink piping consistency, and I'm just going along the edge of the cookie, leaving just a little bit of a gap so that white is showing. You can go right along the edge, but I am not that talented yet. I will hopefully get better, but I am not that good yet. So I like to leave a little bit of a gap there. It just makes me feel a little bit more comfortable and I don't have to worry about screwing that up too much. I'm going to make the little buttons here. I went diagonal. You can go straight down if that's what you prefer, but I thought this would add a little bit of interest to it, and adding some buttons with that piping consistency once again. Next, we are going to move on to the bottle. I'm going to start with the bottom section, and I'm going to do different sections in this because I want there to be definition between the sections. So I'll let each section crust over before moving on to the next. If you don't care about having any definition between the sections, you can go right from one to the other. So the bottom part, I am doing the white outline, white consistency, flood consistency in the middle. And I'm going to put one giant strawberry in the bottom right-hand corner. Spreading that out with my scribe once again, and I'm pretty much doing the same thing as I did on the previous cookie. I'm just making a little bit bigger of a strawberry and only one single one. And this way I can add a little bit more detail, not a whole lot, but a little bit more to this strawberry because there's only one and it's significantly larger. I have a little bit more time to work on it. So again, I'm going to add my little seeds here, and this time I am going to add a little bit of texture to them or a little bit of shape to them rather than having them just be little dots. And for the leaves on the strawberry, I'm pretty much just going to kind of make a star so that some of them are on top of the strawberry and some of them are kind of sticking off the top. And then I'll take my scribe just to kind of spread those or kind of make them a little bit more pointy so they look a little bit more like leaves. Now for the sides, for like the measuring part of the bottle, I guess you could say, I'm just going to add straight lines, but I'm not going to use a flood consistency for this. I know that this is piping consistency and I'm putting it right on flood icing, so it's going to kind of sit on top, but it will settle a little bit. If I used flood consistency on this, it would spread too much and the lines would be way too thick. So I'm going to let that dry for just a little bit, maybe 20 minutes or so before I add the next layer. And this is just basically that little, I guess where you would screw it in, screw the top onto the bottom. I don't know. There's probably a technical name for that, but I don't know it. It's just this small little section here. I didn't really even have to outline it, but I do let this crust over for about 10 minutes or so that I can add those little line details. If I add them too soon, they're just going to kind of sink in. And I added these before I added the top part, just so that I don't have to stop my line. Sometimes when you stop your lines, you end up with kind of like a bead at each end. And this, I can go right onto that plain part of the cookie and not have to worry about it because it's going to be covered up anyway. So that will only take about 5 minutes to crust over because it is a piping consistency and it's not so thick where I can't take my scribe and kind of fix up some of my lines. So for the final part here, I am going to outline and flood just like I have been, and we're just going to kind of leave this plain. And again, I am so sorry for this angle. I am used to working with my camera directly above me, and so I didn't really have to worry about a piping bag getting in the way. So I keep forgetting that I'm recording. So I apologize for the camera kind of going in and out of focus and my hand being right in the camera, but I will get better, I promise. So I am flooding that, spreading that out with my scribe once again, and that is it for this one. Next up will be the onesie. And I really wasn't sure how I wanted to do this one. I didn't want to do it exactly the same as the other one, but I still wanted to pull in that strawberry theme somehow. So I am going to flood this entirely with that pink. So once again, I am outlining and flooding, and then I'm letting this crust. I do want to say that I have this sped up, I believe, 4 times. So I am pretty slow. I didn't want to do this real time just because we'd probably be here for an hour and a half or more if I showed everything in real time. So I have this sped up by about 4 times, 3 or 4 times. So that is all spread out. And again, I'm using my scribe. This is, I forget the name of it, but it's by the Cookie Countess, and it's a larger tip to it, and I like it for larger areas. I use this often, and it's got like a little scraper on this side and other end of it. So this is one of my favorite ones to use. I'll link it below. Once that is crusted over for quite a while, I let this go for a little bit. I am going to do a mini wet on wet technique on this. So I'm starting with my white flood consistency, and I'm just kind of making a circle there right in the center of the onesie. This will spread out a little bit, so I don't bother to outline it. It pretty much will make a circle on its own, and then I'm going to go in and make the strawberry. Now this is a tiny little strawberry. So to make the seeds on it, I was too nervous to go in with my piping bag just because I felt like the seeds would end up being too big. And again, they will spread once they hit that wet icing. And I just figured they would just end up taking over the entire thing. So I took a little bit of my piping, or no, not my piping, my flood consistency white icing, and I'm using my Scribe just to kind of dip that in the icing and barely touch the little strawberry there and making my little seeds. And I got this idea from my mom, so thank you very much, Mom. This worked beautifully. So I'm going to outline this onesie just like I did with the previous one, but I didn't add really any details to it except for the little buttons on the bottom. That truly makes it a onesie. I was trying to think in my head what a onesie looks like with like the seams on the sleeves and everything. So I contemplated whether or not to add those, but at this point in the game, I was a little too nervous to add too much detail and end up ruining it. So I decided to just leave it as is. So next is the little rattle here, and you'll see that I have a little bit of a nick in my, the corner there in my cookie itself. These are sugar cookies, but they are brown sugar cinnamon. And I think I had a little chunk of cinnamon there, and when it came out of the oven, it kind of melted, and I ended up with that little nick. So I didn't do with this cookie what I had planned on doing. I planned on doing a whole big wet on wet technique here, but I was too afraid of that little nick of the icing ending up spilling over the side. So I ended up just flooding in white and letting that crust over. I did the same thing with the bottom portion. I guess it would be the handle of it, and just added a little bit of a circle there. Again, I didn't outline it because it's small, and it will kind of create a circle on its own. So I let that crust over, and I just decided to kind of just use the colors that I've been using. And I just added dots all around the edge of this. Now this does have a nice crust on it, but I am using my piping consistency. And because it is a thinner piping consistency, it's definitely thicker than a flood, but thinner than a lot of piping consistency. It's definitely not too thick. It will kind of settle on its own. And I'm just using the green and the pink, and just kind of alternating as I go around. That way I can still keep with the colors, but I don't risk adding too much detail with this and having the icing spill over the edge where that little nick is. I tapped this a few times just to get those peaks to settle down a little bit, and it did the job. For the, I guess this would be the handle. I didn't have to outline this again for such a small area, and my flood icing is not too thin. I wouldn't have had an issue if I didn't outline this area at all, but I did. I am using my Scribe, but you'll see that I don't get too close to the part that's already crusted over. I'd rather just push the icing towards it rather than going over it with my Scribe. Finally, I am just going to add a ribbon around the rattle there, kind of where those areas jut out on the side. I meant to put a bow there, but I'm not that talented yet, so we'll just stick to a small ribbon. But that is it for that one. I want to thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.